How does a father, barely out of childhood himself, end up taking the life of his own baby girl? This is the story of Jayden Straight, a teenage dad whose life spiraled into a nightmare no one saw coming, and a tragedy no one can forget. But what truly happened on the day Raija lost her life? And what secrets would the investigation uncover? To understand this harrowing tale, we must first delve into the lives of those involved. Jayden Straight was just 17 years old, residing in Des Moines, Iowa. He was a typical teenager in many respects, navigating the tumultuous waters of adolescence. But unlike his peers, Jayden faced the immense responsibility of fatherhood at a tender age. His daughter, Raija, was an 8-month-old infant, described by family members as a joyful and innocent child. She had just begun to explore the world around her, her laughter filling the rooms of their modest home. On July 13, 2018, the tranquility of their household was shattered. Jayden was left alone to care for Raija, while her mother, Raija, attended to errands. What transpired during those hours remains a subject of profound sorrow and disbelief. Later that day, Raija was rushed to Mercy Medical Center in Des Moines. Medical professionals were confronted with a horrifying scene. The infant had sustained multiple skull fractures, a ruptured spleen, several broken ribs, and massive retinal hemorrhaging. Dr. Paul Perizek, a Des Moines Police Department sergeant, later remarked, "It is heart-wrenching what she potentially went through." The severity of Raija's injuries was likened to those sustained from a significant fall, underscoring the brutality of the assault. Jayden, upon realizing the gravity of the situation, turned himself in to the authorities. He was subsequently charged with first-degree murder and child endangerment resulting in death. As the investigation unfolded, a clearer picture began to emerge. Interviews with family members and neighbors painted a portrait of a young man overwhelmed by the demands of early parenthood. There were accounts of Jayden struggling to cope, exhibiting signs of frustration and distress. Raija's mother, Raija, provided a poignant insight into the dynamics of their relationship. She recounted instances where Jayden displayed impatience and anger, particularly when left alone with the baby. Medical experts concluded that Raija's injuries were the result of a deliberate assault, ruling out any possibility of an accidental cause. The evidence pointed to a violent shaking episode, a tragic manifestation of Jayden's inability to manage his emotions. In court, Jayden pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, willful injury, and child endangerment. He was sentenced to a total of 100 years in prison, a term that ensures he will likely spend the remainder of his life behind bars. The community grappled with the aftermath of this tragedy. Candlelight vigils were held in Raija's memory, with many expressing their grief and disbelief over the loss of such a young life. This case serves as a stark reminder of the challenges faced by teenage parents and the dire consequences that can arise from unchecked emotions. It underscores the necessity for support systems to assist young individuals thrust into the demanding role of parenthood. Raija's brief life, though tragically cut short, has left an indelible mark on the community. Her story compels us to reflect on the vulnerabilities of young families and the importance of providing them with the resources they need to thrive. May we remember Raija and strive to prevent such tragedies in the future. Des Moines, Iowa. On the surface, it's a quiet Midwestern city known for its close-knit communities and family-friendly neighborhoods. But in 2018, the town would find itself at the center of a heart-wrenching tragedy that no one could have anticipated. At the heart of this story is Jayden Straight, a 17-year-old boy grappling with responsibilities far beyond his years. Jayden was like many other teenagers in his town. He was young, ambitious, and trying to find his place in the world. But unlike most of his peers, Jayden was also a father. At just 17, he welcomed his daughter Raija into the world, a beautiful baby girl with a bright smile and a joyful spirit. Raija was everything you'd imagine a baby to be: curious, bubbly, and full of potential. Her mother, Raija, had high hopes for her daughter and tried her best to create a loving home, despite the challenges of raising a child so young. But while Raija thrived in her mother's care, Jayden struggled. Fatherhood had come unexpectedly, and the weight of responsibility was crushing for someone still navigating his own adolescence. He faced a world of pressure, financial, emotional, and social, and over time, cracks began to show. Jayden's relationship with Rai was complicated. The two teens, barely out of high school, often found themselves at odds over how to raise their daughter. Arguments about parenting, money, and personal goals became a frequent occurrence. Despite the conflict, there were moments of happiness, moments where Jayden seemed to embrace his role as a father. Then came the evening of July 13th, 2018, a day that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. That night, Jayden was left alone with Raija, while her mother was out running errands. Hours later, a call was made to 911. Raija was unresponsive, her tiny body showing signs of severe trauma. First responders rushed her to Mercy Medical Center, but the injuries were too extensive. Raija was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. The injuries shocked everyone. Multiple skull fractures, internal bleeding, broken ribs, and other signs of physical abuse. They were injuries no infant could possibly survive. The damage was extensive and consistent with violent shaking or blunt force trauma. This was not an accident. Later that same night, Jayden Straight was arrested. Police reported that his explanation of the events leading to Raija's injuries didn't match the medical evidence. His calm demeanor during questioning struck many as unnerving, and detectives began to uncover troubling details about his behavior leading up to the tragedy. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors couldn't believe it. A teenager, barely an adult himself, accused of such a horrific crime. Many wondered, how could this have happened? How could someone so young be capable of harming their own child? This wasn't just a case of violence, it exposed something far more significant. It revealed the dangerous intersection of youth, responsibility, and unchecked emotion. It forced people to confront the harsh realities faced by teenage parents. Young individuals thrust into an adult world without the tools or support needed to navigate it. But while the community mourned Raija and struggled to comprehend Jayden's actions, investigators were hard at work uncovering the truth about what happened that night, and what they found would leave even seasoned detectives shaken. What really happened in that home? And what would lead a 17-year-old father to commit such an unthinkable act? The answers lie in the details of an investigation that uncovered more than anyone was prepared to face. To understand how a teenage father could commit such an unimaginable act, we need to start at the very beginning. Jayden Straight's early life. His story is one of struggle, instability, and a childhood that left him unprepared for the responsibilities that would come crashing into his world. Jayden grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, a city known for its quiet charm, but behind closed doors his life was anything but peaceful. Born into a family struggling with its own demons, Jayden's early years were marked by chaos and neglect. His parents had a tumultuous relationship, arguments that shook the walls, inconsistent parenting, and long stretches where he was left to fend for himself. At school, Jayden struggled to fit in. Teachers noticed his frequent absences, his difficulty concentrating, and his quick temper. He was often described as a boy searching for stability in a world that seemed to offer him none. By the time he reached high school, Jayden's behavioral issues had escalated. Fights, suspensions, and brushes with authority became a pattern in his life. But beneath the anger and frustration was a young boy desperate for connection. Those who knew Jayden said he had a softer side, a boy who could make others laugh, who dreamed of a better life, but who lacked the guidance to find it. In his sophomore year of high school, Jayden met Rai Bambino. Rai was outgoing, ambitious, and seemed to be everything Jayden wasn't. Their connection was instant, a whirlwind teenage romance filled with passion, but also volatility. Their relationship was an escape for Jayden, a brief respite from the turmoil of his home life. But as quickly as their relationship began, cracks started to form. The couple would argue frequently, often over small misunderstandings that escalated into explosive fights. Their on-again, off-again romance became a familiar pattern. One moment they were inseparable. The next, they were barely speaking. Everything changed when Rai discovered she was pregnant at just 16 years old. Both teenagers were overwhelmed by the news. Ree's family, though disappointed, rallied around her, determined to support her through the journey of motherhood. Jayden, however, found himself at a crossroads. He promised to step up, to be the father he never had, but the weight of that promise was more than he could bear. On November 12th, 2017, baby Raija was born. For a brief moment, she brought light into a world that had often been dark for Jayden. Family members recall how his face lit up when he held her for the first time, how he vowed to give her the love and support he never received. But as the days turned into weeks, the challenges of parenthood began to set in. Raija was a happy, curious baby. Family photos show her smiling, her big brown eyes wide with wonder. She loved the sound of lullabies and would giggle whenever someone played peekaboo. Her mother, Rai, described her as a perfect baby, saying that her laughter could brighten even the darkest days. But while Rai embraced motherhood, Jayden began to pull away. The late nights, the constant crying, and the demands of caring for an infant took a toll on him. Friends and neighbors started to notice the strain. Jayden seemed tired, irritable, and often overwhelmed. The tension in Jayden and Ree's relationship grew after Raija's birth. Arguments became more frequent, often about money, parenting, and Jayden's growing absence. Ree's friends noticed that she often seemed stressed and exhausted, carrying the weight of raising Raija largely on her own. Jayden's family members, too, began to worry. They had seen his temper before, but now they feared what might happen if he snapped. Cut to interviews or quotes from neighbors or family members. You could tell he was struggling. He loved his daughter, but it was clear he didn't know how to handle the pressure. In the months leading up to Raija's death, there were whispers among those who knew the family, concerns about Jayden's ability to cope, about his outbursts of frustration when left alone with the baby. Some neighbors recalled hearing shouting late at night, followed by moments of eerie silence. Despite the warning signs, no one could have predicted what would happen on that fateful evening in July. Raija's death would not only shatter her family, but also force a community to confront the consequences of a young man's breaking point. But what led to that breaking point? What was happening behind closed doors that no one saw, or that some chose to ignore? The answers lie in the events of that tragic night and the investigation that followed. July 13th, 2018, began like any other summer day in Des Moines. The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood where Jayden Straight, Ree Bambino, and their 8-month-old daughter, Raija, lived. But by the end of that evening, nothing would ever be the same. According to police reports, Ree Bambino had stepped out of the house that evening to run errands, leaving Jayden alone with Raija. It wasn't unusual. Jayden had watched his daughter many times before, though Ree later admitted she always felt uneasy leaving the baby alone with him. Neighbors described hearing strange sounds coming from the home that night, loud banging, followed by the unmistakable cries of a baby in distress. Some said they considered calling the police, but the noise stopped as quickly as it started. At 8:43 p.m., a frantic 911 call was placed. The caller was Jayden. He told the dispatcher that his daughter wasn't breathing and that he didn't know what had happened. "She just stopped breathing," he said. First responders rushed to the scene. When paramedics arrived, they found Raija unresponsive. She was rushed to Mercy Medical Center, but it was already too late. The doctors who examined her were horrified by what they saw. Raija's injuries were not consistent with a simple accident. Her body told a much darker story. Medical reports revealed that Raija had suffered multiple skull fractures, internal bleeding, and broken ribs. Her tiny body bore the signs of violent shaking and blunt force trauma. These injuries, experts said, were no accident. They were the result of sustained and severe abuse. The type of injuries we saw, especially the skull fractures, require a significant amount of force. This wasn't a fall or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was intentional. The injuries also indicated something even more disturbing. Raija had likely been suffering for weeks, if not months, before her death. Signs of older bruising and healing fractures pointed to a pattern of abuse. The death of a child is always devastating, but in this case, it struck a nerve with the entire community. News of Raija's death spread quickly, leaving neighbors, friends, and even strangers reeling with shock and anger. A candlelight vigil was held in her memory, with people demanding justice for the innocent life that had been taken. Jayden, however, remained at the center of the investigation. His initial statements to the police were vague and inconsistent. He claimed that Raija had fallen from the couch while he was in another room. He insisted that her death was a tragic accident, but detectives weren't convinced. As the hours passed, Jayden's story began to unravel. When asked about the older injuries discovered during the autopsy, he had no explanation. When confronted with the medical examiner's findings, he grew defensive, even angry. His calm demeanor from earlier in the interrogation gave way to frustration and denial. The people of Des Moines couldn't believe what they were hearing. Jayden, the teenage father who had once been seen holding Raija in his arms with pride, was now accused of ending her life. For many, it was unfathomable. How could someone so young, someone who should have had his whole life ahead of him, commit such a brutal act? Bambino, Raija's mother, was devastated. In a statement to the press, she described her daughter as her whole world and said she had trusted Jayden to take care of her. "I never thought he would hurt her," she said through tears. "I don't understand how this happened." But as investigators dug deeper into Jayden's life, they uncovered troubling details that painted a clearer picture of what may have led to this tragedy. Jayden's temper, his frustration with the responsibilities of fatherhood, and his growing isolation all pointed to a young man who was in over his head. What drove Jayden to this breaking point, and what would the investigation reveal about the events leading up to that fateful night? The answers were more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. As the shockwaves of Raija's death spread through the community, investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. What really happened inside the Straight home that night, and why had no one intervened before it was too late? The answers would come from a relentless investigation that left no stone unturned. From the very beginning, detectives found Jayden Straight's account suspicious. His claim that Raija had fallen off the couch didn't align with the severity of her injuries. The autopsy confirmed their suspicions. This was no accident. Forensic evidence painted a grim picture of what Raija had endured in the weeks leading up to her death. Bruises in various stages of healing, broken ribs that were never treated, and older fractures to her tiny arms. All signs of prolonged abuse. The medical examiner stated that the trauma she suffered on the day she died was equivalent to being hit with the force of a car crash. The level of force required to inflict these injuries was extreme. This wasn't a one-time incident. This child suffered over an extended period. Detectives also examined the crime scene carefully. They found no evidence of a fall, no blood, no signs of impact near the couch where Jayden claimed the accident occurred. What they did find, however, was disturbing. A broken baby bottle, dents in the drywall, and a small patch of blood on a baby blanket. As detectives pieced together the evidence, they turned to those who knew Jayden and Raija best. Family members and neighbors were questioned, and their accounts revealed a darker side to Jayden's life, one that had gone unnoticed, or worse, ignored. We would hear them arguing sometimes, yelling, doors slamming. I guess I just thought it was normal, you know? Young parents figuring things out. A family member described Jayden's struggles with fatherhood as overwhelming. He loved Raija, but he couldn't handle the responsibility. He would get frustrated when she cried, and sometimes he'd just storm off and leave her with Ree. Another neighbor recalled seeing bruises on Raija during a rare trip to the park. When she asked Ree about it, Ree shrugged it off, saying the baby was clumsy. Looking back, the neighbor admitted, "I should have said something. I should have done more." As the pressure mounted, Jayden's story began to unravel. Confronted with the forensic evidence and witness testimonies, he initially denied any wrongdoing. But after hours in the interrogation room, he finally broke down. According to police records, Jayden admitted that he had lost control on the night of Raija's death. He claimed she wouldn't stop crying and that he had been exhausted from weeks of sleepless nights and stress. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he reportedly said. "I just wanted her to stop crying." Detectives pressed him on the older injuries. Jayden admitted that this wasn't the first time he'd lost his temper with Raija. He described moments where he'd grabbed her too hard or slapped her out of frustration. Each time, he told himself it wouldn't happen again, but it did. Jayden's confession led to his arrest on charges of first-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. The trial that followed captured the nation's attention, with every detail of the case dissected in the courtroom and the media. Raija's mother, Bambino, gave an emotional testimony that left the courtroom in tears. Through sobs, she recounted the moments she trusted Jayden to care for their daughter, never imagining that trust would end in tragedy. "She was just a baby. She didn't deserve this. I'll never forgive myself for leaving her that night." Prosecutors painted Jayden as an immature and volatile teenager who let his frustration turn into violence. They argued that he had every opportunity to seek help, but instead chose to take his anger out on an innocent child. The defense, however, argued that Jayden's actions were not premeditated. They brought in psychologists to testify about the immense pressure young parents face, particularly those without strong support systems. They described Jayden as a scared, overwhelmed teenager who made a series of tragic mistakes. Jayden lacked the tools to manage his emotions and responsibilities. While this does not excuse his actions, it helps us understand how he reached this breaking point. Despite these arguments, the jury's decision was swift. Jayden was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, except for the quiet sobs of Raija's family. But the trial was only the beginning. In the aftermath of Raija's death, questions remained. Could this tragedy have been prevented? And what lessons can we learn from the heartbreaking story of a teenage father pushed to his limits? After weeks of courtroom drama, emotional testimony, and a relentless search for answers, the moment of truth arrived. The verdict that would determine the fate of a teenage father who had taken his baby's life, a decision that would reverberate throughout the small town of Des Moines and the entire country. On the morning of September 22, 2019, Jayden Straight stood before the judge, his head down, his eyes vacant, as the jury delivered their verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. It was a conviction that shocked many. Some expected manslaughter, others hoped for a lighter sentence, but none could deny the devastating weight of what had happened. The judge, Honorable Patricia Gordon, addressed Jayden with words that seemed to pierce the silence in the room. She acknowledged the youthfulness of the defendant, but emphasized that youth could never excuse the brutality of a life taken too soon. "You were a child yourself," she said, "but the moment you chose to have a child, you became responsible for another human life. A life that had no voice, no way of defending itself, and in the end, that child is gone." Jayden was sentenced to 40 years in prison. As he was led away, his expression remained emotionless, his fate sealed by the horrific actions of one fateful night. But for Raija's family, the pain would never fade. They knew that no amount of time behind bars could bring their precious baby back. The verdict sparked mixed reactions within the community. For some, there was an understanding of Jayden's struggles. These were teenagers, barely out of childhood themselves, thrust into the unimaginable responsibility of parenthood. Many felt sympathy for a boy who had clearly been in over his head, a young father who, despite his best efforts, had cracked under the pressure. Others, however, felt only anger and disbelief. How could a father, no matter his age, hurt his own child? They couldn't fathom how Jayden could allow his frustration to reach such a tragic point. For them, sympathy was nowhere to be found. "What he did was unforgivable," one neighbor said. "No excuse can justify taking the life of a child." As Raija's family struggled with their grief, the town began to reckon with its role in this tragedy. Could the signs have been seen earlier? Should someone have intervened before it was too late? In the wake of Raija's death, a national conversation began to unfold about teenage parents and the immense pressure they face. Advocates for children and families called for better resources, more education, and stronger support systems for young parents who often find themselves overwhelmed, isolated, and unequipped to handle the responsibility of raising a child. Raija's death became a catalyst for a movement, as experts and community leaders called for early intervention programs that could prevent these kinds of tragedies. Some suggested parenting classes, counseling, and peer mentorship as vital tools for young parents who lacked the guidance or resources to succeed. Teenagers are still developing emotionally and psychologically. The transition into parenthood, especially for someone so young, can be incredibly overwhelming. Without proper support, these young parents may not have the skills or resources to manage the immense stress they're under. Alongside these calls for action, there was another urgent plea: to recognize the signs of child abuse early and take steps to protect children like Raija before it's too late. Many recalled signs in Jayden's life, outbursts of anger, isolation, and neglect that, if addressed, might have prevented Raija's death. According to experts, child abuse is not always immediately visible. Signs can be subtle: changes in behavior, unexplained injuries, or a parent's increasing inability to cope. If these signs are recognized early, professionals can intervene before a situation escalates to something as tragic as what happened to Raija. Raija's death, as painful and tragic as it was, led to a nationwide movement for reform in how society supports young parents and identifies child abuse. Parents, especially those struggling with their own unresolved issues, need help, not judgment. And children, no matter their background or family situation, deserve a chance at life free from violence. While nothing will ever bring Raija back, her story serves as a stark reminder of the critical need for action. As we reflect on this tragedy, we must ask ourselves, how can we prevent this from happening again? And what can we do to protect those who are most vulnerable, the children who depend on us to keep them safe? The case of Jayden Straight and Raija is a reminder of the fragility of life and the immense responsibility that comes with parenthood. While Jayden's youth and struggles may have played a role in his actions, they do not excuse the life he took. For Raija's family, the pain will never end, and justice, though served, is bittersweet. But perhaps, in the wake of this tragedy, we can all learn something. Whether it's recognizing the early signs of abuse or understanding the pressures that young parents face, we all have a part to play in preventing future tragedies. Thank you for watching. If you or someone you know is experiencing difficulties as a young parent, there are resources available to help. And if you or someone you know is a victim of abuse, please reach out for help, because no one should ever have to suffer in silence. For more stories like this, and to help us raise awareness about the critical issues affecting families today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.